talk about election security and safeguarding the United States from external threats. We're privileged to have Ken Wainstein with us today, Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the Department of Homeland Security. I'll introduce Ken in a little more detail in a moment. But let me just sort of say at the outset that what we're here to talk about is this sort of increasingly gray line between the foreign and the domestic. And this is something that I think is incredibly troubling to a lot of people. It's something that is really, really difficult to grapple with. And the folks we have here today are the exact right people to talk about it. So we have a country and a set of institutions. We all know this. We have an old constitution. It was set up with two oceans on the sides of us, weeks to get across those to communicate. We built our institutions with the idea that we could put a really bright line between the foreign and the domestic. Foreign was really far away, right? But even then, we were very concerned about foreign interference. We've always been concerned about foreign interference. But if you fast forward those threats to a time where they are effectively instantaneous, a system that is built on this distinction between foreign and domestic is something that requires a ton of thought, constant maintenance, and serious public servants to take advantage and to help us kind of navigate through those waters. So to help us talk about that, we have Ken Wainstein here. As I said, Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the Department of Homeland Security. Came to government from private practice, but prior to that spent 20 years in law enforcement in various national security roles inside of government. Homeland Security advisor to George W. Bush, Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice, General Counsel for the FBI and Chief of Staff to Robert Mueller. He received his law degree from a school I hadn't heard of previously in the Bay Area. I looked it up, seems decent, but is redeemed by the fact that he comes to us as a BA from the University of Virginia. And his daughter is here with us now, and so incredibly excited to have Ken Wainstein with us. Thanks, Ken. And talking to Ken today, we'll have Ashley Deeks. Ashley is a great friend of the Batten School and of the National Security Policy Center. She is a professor of law here at the University of Virginia, director of the National Security Law Center there. And previously, quite recently, and part of what I think is going to inform this conversation to a great degree, was Associate White House Counsel and Deputy Legal Advisor at the NSC in the early part of the Biden administration. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you two and expect to learn a great deal from the conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Phil. Thanks to the Batten School and the Karsh Institute of Democracy and the Miller Center for hosting this and for bringing us here today. And especially thanks to Ken for taking the time to come down and talk to us. I'm very pleased to moderate this conversation, to ask you some provocative questions, given your really deep and very broad experience in the U.S. government over the years and your current role at DHS. So I thought we might start by setting a little bit of background to you so you could tell us a bit about the office that you currently lead. Most people, I think, know a decent amount about some of the actors inside the intelligence community, FBI, CIA, NSA we now know about, DNI. People may have heard a little bit less about DHS's Office of Intelligence and Analysis and what it does. So I wonder if you could start off by talking to us a little bit about the mission of your office and how it is evolving to meet changing demands on it.
Sure, but if I could just take license to say a couple things. First, it's great to see all you and thank you for being here. I'm here with a couple of my colleagues, Sarah Kenny, Steve Cash, and myself. We're all from INA. It's a real honor to be here, and this has been a great opportunity to learn about what Batten does. It's really incredible. Starting with what you've done to this room, just tremendous. I do recall coming into this building once. I was here at UVA, it was like the Hoover administration, actually fairly close, early 80s. And I think I came in here to like drop a class that was too hard. And that's probably the only reason I came into this building. And it did not look like this. Tremendous what you've done, but also obviously more importantly, as a matter of public policy and the public policy conversation that's so important today, really incredible what this organization has done and its sister organizations here at UVA. So very proud to be part of it. Proud to have my daughter Cecily and her boyfriend and friends who got out of bed to come hear me. And I thought it was me at first, and then I realized they knew there was free pizza, and that was the reason they're here. So great to have them. So the Office of Intelligence Analysis, we are part of the Department of Homeland Security, and the tee up here I think was absolutely perfect, because in talking about the intersection of foreign intelligence and domestic intelligence, or foreign threat and domestic threat, because that intersection is exactly where we at INA sit. That's where we sit, that's where we're designed to sit. And to sort of understand what our office does, which, as you say, Ashley, it's not intuitive to most Americans what it is that we do. People know what the CIA does. They develop sources and spies, they brief the president. People know what the NSA does. It does cryptology and it does signals intelligence. People don't really know what INA does. And to understand it, you sort of have to go back to 9/11. And interestingly, we swear in all our new people at INA at Ground Zero up in New York City. And when I swear them in 5-6 times a year, I ask them, where they were on 9/11. And we've now gotten to a point where a number of the people who are starting at INA weren't alive on 9/11. And so the lessons of 9/11, it's important to remind all of us what they are. And one of those was that in terms of connecting the dots, which is the term that everybody used after 9/11, that we didn't sufficiently connect the dots to prevent the attacks from happening. One of the reasons why that didn't happen was we didn't have sufficient connectivity between the federal law enforcement and intelligence apparatus and the hundreds and thousands of state, local, territorial, tribal, and private sector partners who were out in the United States who had information that could have helped us detect and possibly derail the plot. We were stood up with DHS in 2003 in the aftermath and because of the 9/11 attacks, with the mandate to help build that intelligence network among all those partners, federal partners, the state and local and other partners out in the United States, that was similar to and as effective as the network that had been developed for generations among the foreign-facing intelligence agencies like NSA and CIA and all their foreign counterparts among our allies. That is our mandate. And so our job is to do that. So a lot of what we do is, for instance, this week, we're going to be on a phone call with 3,000 to 4,000 of our partners, state and local officials from around the country, talking about what we see in terms of the coming threat environment, sharing with them intelligence that we've developed at the federal level and getting from them intelligence from out in the field, critical intelligence on the field that helps inform what the federal government does. So our job is to develop that network, which, back to your point, means we are right at the intersection of the foreign threat and the domestic threat.
Great, that's very helpful. Just so one follow-up. I wonder if you could say a little bit about how your office's work intersects with a couple of different actors. One of them is the FBI, which we think of as doing a lot of domestic investigations, and maybe also CISA, which I understand is within DHS, but is very focused on cyber threats. Could you just say a little bit about how you engage with them?
Yeah, that's an important question. So that raises the question of, okay, when you look at the range of intelligence agencies, what is assigned to each agency? Who has which job? And what you'll find, and this is designedly so, is that there's overlap among all the agencies. So there's not, a clear delineation between what the CIA does and NSA does. There's some overlap, let's say. That's particularly the case in the FBI, with the FBI and us, because the FBI is both a law enforcement and an intelligence agency. That's the beauty of it. That's its strongest asset in its ability to protect against national security threats. But by doing intelligence work in the domestic space, that overlaps with what we do. The reality is, in practice, the FBI's focus is largely investigative, They generate intelligence products out to the state and local partners about, strategic intelligent threat topics. But their first mandate is to run the investigations. So whenever there's a question of a Chinese spy here in the United States, or a foreign terrorist threat, or a domestic terrorist threat, their joint terrorism task forces out in the United States are running those investigations down. And that's their primary focus. Our primary focus, once again, also in the intelligence space, we don't investigate and make criminal cases. We don't do that. We don't have investigative powers. We don't have search warrant authority. We can't arrest people. None of that. We generate and share intelligence. Our main job is to provide information to, for instance, a Homeland Security advisor for the Commonwealth of Virginia, or the governor of West Virginia, about the looming threats in the United States and specifically in their area, so that they can decide, we need to provide more resources to our police. We need to reach out to the critical infrastructure sector because they're going to be the subject of the next threat. We need to create new regulations that help us defend against the threat that we're learning about from the federal government. That's our job. CISA, and their focus is cybersecurity and protection of critical infrastructure, is a sister agency of ours within DHS. So we work very closely with them. So for example, they are hyper-focused on the election. The elections is a subsector of what's called the government critical infrastructure, and they have the primary responsibility within the federal government of protecting or helping states who run the elections protect the election processes. We're constantly generating intelligence for CISA to help them guide their safeguards and protective efforts vis-a-vis the state elections. So we work hand in glove. We do the intelligence work. They provide the mitigation, training, best practices, and the like.
Great, that's really helpful, thanks. And I do want to talk about some specific threats, including elections, in just a sec. But before we turn to the specific threats, I thought it could be helpful to talk a little bit about the changing threat landscape at a more macro level. By most accounts, it has changed pretty significantly since September 11th and the decade that follows. Now, many of the most salient threats seem to be from domestic violent terrorism and extremism. So I wonder if you had any thoughts about kind of what accounts for that shift, how the US government thinks about that shift, and whether and how the government has kind of reorganized it all to take into account that kind of the current threat landscape.
Yeah, that's a meaty question. So it is interesting. As you heard from my bio, I started in the federal government in 1988, a long time ago, and I did about 21 years in federal government. I was in the Justice Department, except for about a year and change in the White House at the end. I left in 2009, inauguration day of 2009. And at that point, the primary terrorism threat that we were focused on was the foreign terrorism threat of 9/11. We were mostly worried about Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and foreign terrorist organizations. Of course, there had been domestic violent extremism. I mean, we had Oklahoma City, and other incidents in the past. But the most lethal, sustained, and troubling threat was foreign terrorism. I stepped back into government in June of 2022, and that had all changed. So it was really sort of interesting for me. It's like I was a bit of a time capsule, and then I got opened again in 2022, and I didn't necessarily fit the current threat. And the reality is, if you look at the threat, what is the most sustained terrorism threat, the most lethal terrorism threat, it isn't the foreign terrorist organizations. They're still out there, and they're still, they could strike at any time, and we need to keep an eye on them. But the one that is the most pernicious right now is domestic violent extremism. Individuals, small groups that are radicalized by ideology and grievances and the like, who then decide, acting out of those ideologies, to strike out and get mobilized. And so that is the primary threat. And in many ways, that's much more, there are two aspects of that I want to cite. One, it's much more difficult because we're talking about people here in the United States. So we're not talking about people who are overseas looking to launch against us. And if it's those people, like what we had on 9/11, we can use the investigative tools and latitude we have overseas that we don't have here because of the Constitution. The Constitution applies here, so we're more limited in what we can do. It's also, if it's a radicalization issue, it's a matter of trying to, predict when a person is going to become radicalized, as opposed to being extremist. You can be extremist, and you have every right to do that. You just don't have the right to become extremist to the point of them being radicalized to violence. How do you evaluate that? So it's more complicated in some ways. The second aspect of that that's worth noting is it's right in our space. INA, we're the domestic intelligence agency. And so that is a space, obviously the Bureau is very much involved in it. They investigate domestic violent extremism, but it really puts the onus on that information sharing network between us and the state and locals, because who's going to have the information about this, somebody out there in the States who might be getting radicalized? It's not going to be the CIA. It's not going to be the NSA. It's going to be the San Bernardino Police Department or the Iowa Sheriff. And it's critical to have that relationship. So in the terrorism space, I mean, obviously the threat has changed in a number of ways, but in the terrorism space, that's been the main change that I've seen.
Yeah, great, thanks. So I wonder if we can turn now to elections, which I think are on everybody's mind, including, I'm sure, yours. You read the newspapers, you sort of get these high-profile reports about Iran hacking into the Trump campaign and then leaking materials to the Biden-Harris campaign, reports about Russian influence operations against the Harris campaign, including deepfake videos to try to discredit Vice President Harris and so on. There's a lot to keep track of for us out here. I wondered maybe you could help us kind of break it down into the different actors who are posing threats to the upcoming elections and the different tactics that they're using to or may use as the election gets even closer to kind of help us situate the problem.
Yeah, let me say it's exceptionally important and timely question. Let me say right up front that when you talk about these influence efforts, these are efforts to influence you and us. And it's the only antidote to these influence efforts by bad actors is education and awareness, so that we're aware that some of the narratives that we're seeing out there, there might be an agenda behind it, and that agenda might be driven by a foreign government that has its own interests at heart, not our interests. So that's a tough thing to deal with. In terms of the different actors, I mean, we have a whole variety, starting on the foreign side. And by the way, we're about to put out the annual Homeland Threat Assessment, which is a publicly available document, I don't know, 50 pages or something, really well done. And it's a high-level overview of the threat facing the homeland. It's the analog to what the Director of National Intelligence puts out every year for the National Threat Assessment. It's the Homeland analog. That'll be coming out soon, and it'll say a lot of what I'm saying here, but say it better, more cogently. But if you look at the threats to the elections, starting with foreign actors, I mean, we've seen the news reports recently about Iran hacking into campaigns, Iran putting out narratives that try to influence the campaign, the Russians doing the same. The Chinese have done some of that as well, and their influence campaigns sometimes are a little bit more subtle, but are out there trying to influence the American public, if not to the same extent as to the specific circumstance of the election. They are certainly out there trying to color people's view of China and its place in the world, inflate the perception of China, and sort of deflate or decrease the status level of the United States. And that influence effort is happening on a regular basis, regardless of the election. Domestically, we have a number of threats, and we talked about domestic violent extremists. We're going to have a lot of people agitating on the lead up to the election. That's fine. That's the American way, right? We have people all sides of the political spectrum, and they're articulating their views, and whether you agree with them or not, God bless the country that allows that to happen. But there are some who have taken their views to the point of trying to disrupt the election. And either disrupt the election beforehand by sending threats to election workers, let's say, we're seeing that, white powdered letters to election workers to scare the election workers and disrupt their operations, to try to hack into voting systems. And, to date, for a number of technical reasons, largely, there's not been any voting systems that have been disrupted in the past. And hopefully that will remain the case, but efforts to maybe get into voter databases, that kind of thing. Out and out threats to candidates. So our former president was shot. Unclear exactly what the motivation is at this point. The FBI is investigating it, but so the threats by bad actors here in the United States sort of go across the range of different types of activities. And that's happening in the lead up to the election. But we could also imagine that happening and anticipate that happening after the election too, because, no matter who wins, there's going to be some people on the other side who thinks that the election wasn't fair, or wasn't fairly conducted. And there'll be, people can question the elections, and once again, that's a healthy thing, to question whether the system was conducted correctly, second guess everything. But there will be some who will probably try to take things into their own hands to try to disrupt the election process past the election day. Of course, we saw that on January 6th, and a lot of effort is going into making sure that doesn't happen again this year.
One question that I'm sure you get asked about a lot is how offices like INA balance their domestic intelligence mission with the constitutional rights of U.S. citizens. You just referred to that in your prior answer, including the First Amendment, Fourth Amendment. We know that INA can't engage in intelligence analysis for purposes of affecting the political processes in the U.S. or for the sole purpose of monitoring someone for activities that our First Amendment protects, and that you're really focused on acts that would result in danger to life. But I'm sure that it is very hard sometimes to assess where to draw the line between bravado in threats, for example, and actual threats on the other, misinformation versus actual threats. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about both sort of substantively about how you think about that line, and then maybe procedurally how you kind of check that you're making the right judgment within DHS.
That is a topic that takes up a huge percentage of our time at INA, in the intelligence community in general, but in particular at INA. And just to sort of step back, I'm sort of a product of my background, as we all are. I was a federal prosecutor for many years. My daughter says she used to come in and fall asleep during my trials when I was a prosecutor. And as a prosecutor, you have a dual responsibility. Your job is to prosecute the case as best you can, build a case, prosecute, and seek and secure conviction if the facts warrant it. But at the same time, your job is to protect the rights of everybody involved in the case, not only the victim, not only the police, but the witnesses and the defendant himself or herself. So you have this sort of dual-hatted responsibility that almost seems to be at tension in some ways, but it's not, because you're just standing up for the law. And if the law says the person should be convicted, amen. If the law says you don't have enough evidence to get a search warrant or to justify an arrest, or you don't have enough evidence to go to trial, then you dismiss the case. That's the way it works in the prosecution space. I say that because that's very intuitive to people. People sort of understand that. That same dual-hattedness, if that's a noun, applies to the intelligence space. Our job is to get the information that'll help decision makers, be it the president, Homeland Security advisor out in Virginia or wherever, make decisions that'll help prevent the next threat, head off a threat that's coming. But at the same time, our job and our equal responsibility is to make sure that we're not intruding on people's constitutional rights and privacy in doing that. Easy to say, hard to do in practice. And INA is where that is particularly hard, and it's for the reason I just said, because we operate here domestically. We do very little overseas. Our job is here where constitutional rights are paramount. And so our job is to constantly be thinking about how we can get intelligence but not violating the Constitution. We do that in a number of ways. One, we have very clear guidance. We are what we like to call the kinder, gentler intelligence agency, in that we are as limited as any intelligence agency in terms of what we can do. You know, for instance, we can only collect information, collect as opposed to analyze and produce intelligence, only collect intelligence if it's publicly available or we do it overtly. We can't lie about who we are, for example, to get intelligence. That's just one example of the limitation on us. So we have these strict limitations. They're clear in guidance. We just stood up a new oversight and transparency office that reports directly to me to focus on that mandate and to give people confidence that we're doing this correctly with the rules. So clear guidance, train. Yesterday I was grumpy because I spent 12 hours doing, online training. Of course, I waited till the deadline, which is today. But it's important to constantly train it. And also to make it clear. And we try to lead by example. We try to make it clear to our folks, look, it's okay if we decide we can't issue an intelligence product in the form that we want to issue it because it would invade someone's privacy. We have to be careful. There's no shame in that. In fact, we're standing up for the right principle. So it's tough because our role is to do intelligence here in the United States, and people are queasy about that. People are less queasy about doing intelligence work overseas, very queasy about doing it here in the United States, and we should be.
Thanks. So I want to talk briefly about the politicization of intelligence, both in terms of collection and analysis. You have served in appointed positions under both Republican Democratic presidents. I'd say that reflects the ideally apolitical nature of intelligence. We are in a very political place right now, politicized, sort of divisive place as a country, and maybe even also within Congress's intelligence committees, which oversee the intelligence community and used to be thought of as less politicized than many other congressional committees. So I wondered if you could say something about how INA in particular and the IC generally tries to navigate domestic intelligence activities when our political landscape is so divided, and US collection on threats, including on election threats, can easily be perceived or misperceived as having a political bias or bent to it.
Yeah, so I'd be interested to hear your perspective since you've lived this. I'm a little bit, maybe a little Pollyannish about this, but I will say that by and large, the people that I've worked with in the national security field, and same with the justice field, at the end of the day, the mission is more important than the politics. And we all have political views. We all have our own interest in who wins a particular election. But, I used to say when I headed up the U.S. Attorney's Office, I might have known the political affiliation of like 3 people in the 700 people who worked in that office, because it didn't matter. It's not like Democrats are pro-murder and Republicans anti-murder, vice versa. It's like everybody sort of agreed with the mission. Same in the national security space. And so I think most people park their politics at the door and focus more when they're in these seats on the mission and on service to the country and national security. That being said, we're all human beings, and we have to be very careful that we don't allow our views to slant what we do, even just a little bit. And as a matter of fact, one of my trainings yesterday was on the politicization of intelligence. I passed.
I wrote that. No, just kidding.
I did pass that one. And the point of that is, look, there's a space there where if you're an intelligence analyst or you're the head of an intelligence agency like me, and you're thinking about how to frame a document about election security, you've got to be incredibly careful that you stick just to the facts. And you don't allow not only your depiction of the facts, but your selection of the facts to be influenced by what political message you might want to say, right? And that makes sense and sounds like it should be easy, but it's really hard because you've got to just look at what you do through this objective lens of what are the facts and what is what threat do these facts add up to that I'm conveying that'll be useful to my customers, regardless whether that is in favor of or against my political view or a political candidate who might be running for office, who might be affected by the political narrative around that particular threat. So back to what I said before, it's constant training, leading by example, and I can tell you on that second score, the Secretary of Homeland Security, alum, is longtime federal prosecutor. I've known him for years, and he has really gone out of his way to emphasize the importance of keeping politics out of intelligence. And there, you can look at some IG reports about some incidents in the past where problems have arisen because that objective lens wasn't applied.
Yep.
And if that happens, the credibility of your organization is shattered. Their ability to actually have an impact with intelligence is diminished, and morale goes down the tubes.
Yep.
So it's really a huge priority for us.
Yep. I want to switch gears and talk about AI, which I understand you have been thinking a lot about. It's a topic that I think, like elections, is on many people's minds. And it seems like AI is going to be a double-edged sword for the intelligence community, including for your office. On the one hand, it will be very helpful, I think, for analysis or identifying unseen connections related to threats. On the other hand, adversaries are going to be able to use it to enable their own work, and indeed have already, I think, started to do so. So how is DHS starting to use AI in its intelligence work, if it is? And how is AI making the US government's life harder by enabling threat actors, including by making it easier and faster for them to produce and disseminate misinformation, deepfakes, and so on?
I know my daughter Cecily is holding her breath because she knows any questions about technology to me is a joke, since I'm routinely asked her to turn on my laptop because I can't figure it out. But AI is, that is an area of peril and promise. You're right. In terms of the promise, look, it's the department, we have a whole initiative that our CIO, Eric Heisen, and our head of science and technology are focused on to make sure that we use AI in ways that are both appropriate, not overly invasive of privacy, but also ramp up the impact and effectiveness of our operations. And you can think about a variety of different ways it can be used. So for example, scanning, cargo shipments at scale to look for patterns that might suggest the shipment of, chemical precursors that are used in the production of fentanyl, for example. I'm just making this up, but that's a classic example of how you have that automated ability to scan across large amounts of data and find patterns. Generative AI, that's an area of great potential so that we can produce product documents more quickly. That's a particular challenge in our area, in the intelligence area, because whenever we write an intelligence product, we have to be able to go back and ascertain and identify the source of all information in those products. And as you know, with generative AI, that can be an issue. But there are a variety of uses on the positive side for DHS, and the Secretary has put in place a strong initiative to try to corral those uses and expand our ability to take advantage of them. The peril of AI is profound, and it doesn't take much imagination to think about it. I mean, you have malign influence narratives that we talked about being generated by our adversaries. They're now able to get those out at scale that they couldn't otherwise because they're able to use AI. Deep fakes, I think wasn't there a videotape of purported to be Joe Biden saying something about how the election was on the wrong day or something like that. This kind of thing that they're able to do capturing people's voices and likeness and then creating deep fakes. We have fraud schemes of a variety of different types, some just good old criminal frauds, but others, by transnational organized criminal organizations that are using AI to perpetrate and perpetuate fraud schemes at a mass scale. So AI is an issue that we are keeping our focus on because it is, it means that down the road, a lot of threats that might have been limited to a few who had special skills might no longer be limited. And a last and scary one is bio threats, use of AI to simplify the generation of bioweapons that can be used to great detriment. That's an area too that's of intense focus.
Yep. I wanted to ask you briefly about classification issues and the idea of overclassification. I teach a class on government secrecy, and we spend a whole class talking about overclassification, the idea being that, of course, the government needs to keep secrets. Of course, there's a lot we want to protect and not let our allies get access to, but too much classification, overclassification can undercut the public's faith in the government. So I know that you've thought a lot about classification and overclassification, including in your time serving on the Public Interest Declassification Board. I know your office now also deals a lot with, and you've mentioned state, local, tribal actors, many of whom I think at least initially lack security clearances. So if you could say a little bit about your views on overclassification and maybe specifically how DHS navigates these classification issues when some of the first version of the products they're producing are classified, but you want to get that information to state and local actors who may not have the same level of clearance, but they're the ones who are really sort of at the pointy end of the spear on some of this.
Yeah, it seems like an arcane issue, but it's actually really important, and it being overclassification of government information. Look, the underlying principle here is that government should maximize transparency. Our job in the government is to tell you as much about what we do as we possibly can. And there are a few reasons for that. One, this is a democracy. You all are our bosses. You can only be effective bosses of the government if you know what we're doing and why we're doing it, right? To the extent that too much of what we do is kept in the dark, you're ignorant of what we do, then our democracy is not working as well as it should. So that's sort of the general principle. Transparency is a good thing. At the same time, we need to be able to operate secretly. And we can't do a lot of our intelligence work if it's all out there in the public, because it's going to go not just to good, rock solid Americans, but also to our adversaries. And so how to balance those two things. And we've seen this come up in a number of different contexts. I spent a lot of time up in Capitol Hill testifying in the aftermath of a number of these leaks that happened, the WikiLeaks and the others that happened I guess that was in the teens.
So, yeah, 2015.
And the debate at the hearings often distilled down to, well, the leaker or, the person who was involved in the leak had to do it because too much of this was classified. So there was stuff that the American people needed to know that wasn't getting out. And that's a legitimate argument, right? My argument is it doesn't justify violating the law, but by leaking, but it's a legitimate argument. So that's a context in which it comes up. But it also comes up in the context that is very, very much sort of near and dear to our heart, which is being able to make sure that those partners I talked about, state, local, territorial, tribal, and private sector partners, every one of them is absolutely critical in defending the homeland. Classification is an obstacle to arming them with the information they need. And this is not a new issue. Right? You mentioned I was the general counsel and chief of staff of the FBI after 9/11. And there's a big focus after 9/11, setting us up was one aspect of it, but to try to get more information out to our state and local partners, recognizing that that was necessary to prevent the next 9/11. And so I was constantly getting calls from governors and police chiefs saying, hey, one person in my police department in my city has a clearance on the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and I, the police chief, don't have a clearance. Well, much progress has been made on that score since then, post 9/11, but still we don't have enough members of our state and local partners who actually have clearances and can see the critical information about the Homeland Security threat. And so it's our job as sort of the statutorily mandated sharer of information with state and local, territorial, tribal, and private sector partners to make sure that we get intelligence, maybe from products from NSA or from CIA, and then we can put them into reformulate it into products that are at a lower level, strip it of a lot of the specifics, the name of the source, the type of method that was used to collect the information, but get the critical information out to our partners so that they can act. And so that is it's a big obstacle, and it's one that we have direct responsibility for.
Got it. Well, I have a lot more questions for Ken, but I know we also wanted to leave time for audience questions. So, with that, I'd like to open it up. Is someone going to bring the microphone around? We have a microphone in the back. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone for you to ask Undersecretary Wainstein. We have a shy audience. This is
I don't
your
believe
shot.
that.
Lots of good questions to ask him.
I'll start calling on people.
I'm good at that. Yeah, we call it cold calling, of course.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'm a third year here. I just
name?
wanted to ask.
What's your name?
Oh, Elise.
Hey, Elise.
I just wanted to ask, how do you know which emerging security threats should be prioritized, and kind of what factors go into your decision making in this?
What was, I've missed the noun there. What was?
Oh, sorry. How do you know which emerging security threats should be prioritized?
That's a great question. You know what? I'm going to ask Steve Cash to answer that question. Steve is the head of our Intelligence Enterprise Office at INA. That's the office that oversees or that coordinates the intelligence aspects of all of DHS, all the components of DHS. Steve is a former CIA officer, former district attorney, and now handles that exact function.
Well, you asked the right question there, and it's not a new question. The entire IC has tried to deal with that question over years, and the way they have come up with it is something called the National Intelligence Priorities Framework, often called the NIPIF, because we do an acronym for everything. And that is both a document and it's a process by which people from the various intelligence community elements and their customers, so somebody from the White House or the State Department, essentially gets in a room and argues about what are the threats that matter and where are we going to put our resources. What we've done at INA is we've taken that model and we have created what is called the Homeland Intelligence Priorities Framework and developed a process by which we take all of the topics that you basically could imagine and we put them out in a paper, and then people argue about it. And it sometimes comes down to people around the table banging their fist on the table and saying, I think elections are more important than cybersecurity. And then somebody else says, cybersecurity is not as important as chemical weapons. And then luckily we have somebody who's the undersecretary who gets to rack and stack them and make a choice. And that's an annual process going on right now, in fact. And in the end, you end up with a priorities framework. And that is not only how the undersecretary can prioritize something, but that becomes essentially the marching orders for everybody in INA. That's how you know if you work there, what are the priorities, what you should work on, what comes first, what comes second. And when you put in your budget requests or your time requests or your personnel requests, that's how you talk about it. This is a high priority, so I need more money, or I need more people, or we need more time, or, and I'll leave you with this, there's two other ways you use this, which is our analysts have what's called a program of analysis. It's essentially a schedule for what we're going to do this year. Here's what we're going to write on. Here are the things we're going to hit. Well, that's informed by that Homeland Intelligence Priorities Framework. And our collectors, when they send people out to go find information, they do the same thing. They have what's called an operating directive, and that takes those priorities and gives them those instructions. So if you worked for us, somebody would say, highest priority, elections. Go forth, do elections, or write on elections. So that's how it's done. You asked exactly the right question.
And it has real life implications in terms of priorities. I remember, for example, there was only a certain amount of bandwidth for getting electronic surveillance against overseas threats. And those that were ranked highest got the attention and got the electronic surveillance. The others that were ranked lower didn't get it. So it makes a big difference.
Hi, my name is Hofzeb. I'm a second year here. You mentioned earlier the importance of developing and maintaining relationships with law enforcement at the grassroots level. We've been seeing over the past decade a rise in distrust in government institutions, and I was wondering if you've ever experienced pushback or any sort of unwillingness to work with law enforcement or intelligence at the federal level, at that local level, when you try to maintain those relationships.
Interesting. So no question that there seemed to be an increase, at least in the vocalness of some of the perceived questioning about the motives of law enforcement. I don't know that that is translated into tension between federal intelligence and law enforcement and our state and local partners. Is that the point of your question? No, I don't think I've seen that. And I actually think, and I look at things through the lens of 9/11 because that was such a searing experience and it was such a turning point. I actually think in many ways the relationship between federal law enforcement and the intelligence community and our state and local part is much better than it was back when I was working with the Metropolitan Police Department in DC doing murder cases back in the 90s. We had a great relationship, but it wasn't reflected in a macro relationship at the higher levels of the government. I think that relationship is much stronger now. And look, I think partly because of the efforts made by federal partners to actually bring the SLTTP, that's what we call them, SLTTP partners, sort of into the fold, mutual need, the recognition, and maybe the mutual need is based on the recognition that, the threats are not, back to the earlier point, they're not binary. They're not foreign or domestic. Whereas the old days we'd say, well, domestic threats, just let law enforcement take care of them. Those threats, and this is sort of the broader theme that we alluded to, but I think it's important to circle back to. You see a lot of the threats that we're dealing with don't really know borders. So you've got cartels, who are trafficking the fentanyl that are killing tens of thousands of Americans every year. Many of them young kids who have no idea that they're risking their lives to the extent that they are. It's just horrendous. Well, those are organizations. I mean, they're not just little crime rings. These are organizations that actually are controlling large areas of territory in Mexico. They're almost quasi-governments. They're getting into traditional legitimate industries. I mean, they are almost playing the roles of quasi-government. Those are threats when they manifest here with drug trafficking and human smuggling. We have to deal with them as both a broader national security threat and a state and local law enforcement threat. That's that mutual need. We can't operate effectively unless we're working well with the San Diego Sheriff's Department. 20 years ago, the intelligence community probably wouldn't have had that much intersection with the San Diego Sheriff's Department. So, same thing with cyber threats. We now have cyber threats that know no boundaries. We have transnational repression here where foreign autocracies like the PRC are opening up police departments within our American cities to try to surveil, harass, oppress people they see as dissidents. and opponents of their regimes. Well, that's both a quintessentially counterintelligence threat that we are focused on, but it's also happening in the streets of our cities. A lot of examples there, but the point is we now have this convergence of threat, which makes a convergence of need, which creates like the imperative of a real partnership. So I think actually that partnership is stronger than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ashley and I'm a third year here. When you were talking about influence operations, you mentioned that education is the best tactic to combat those threats. And I was wondering how you see that education moving forward on such a broad level and how the intelligence community perceives their role in those efforts.
It's a tough issue, right? Because our job is to identify and then help decision makers make decisions about how to respond to threats, Homeland Security threats. And one of those threats that is cognizable for us, that's within our mission space, is malign narratives being created by foreign actors who are trying to influence our politics. We can use our intelligence tools against that. Now, if somebody here in the United States is generating narratives that might be completely false, might be completely, complete exaggerations, hyperbole, undignified, whatever, they have a right to do that because we have a First Amendment, back to your question. And you have the right to do that. So we have to be careful that we distinguish between those narratives that are being propounded by foreign parties, which is a counterintelligence threat, and those that are being propounded by Americans. And so the way the intelligence community is doing it, and you might have seen this, is the Director of National Intelligence has been issuing public statements. And I think there have been maybe 3 or 4 of them about Iran and Russia and others, just saying, this is what we're seeing. And it helps to educate people that these are narratives that are coming from foreign adversaries. But it's really hard because, right, because those same narratives could be being propounded by Americans, and that's fine. That's really the best way to do it. It's probably the only way to do it. And in fact, if you go back and look at the 2016 election and the intelligence community assessment, the intelligence community put out an assessment right after that election, which found that the Russians interfered in the election. There's a lot of political sort of discourse and hoo-ha about it. But at the end of the day, it showed that we are now in a new era where foreign states are doing their best to try to both sow discord, because that in and of itself is to the advantage of our foreign adversaries, undermine our democracy because they want our democracy to fail, but also they have specific agendas in elections. They want particular, elections to go to particular ways. And it's a tremendous challenge. So the education just has to be, lay it bare. This is what it is, and let the American people then judge. But they'll hopefully judge better, knowing that there are some malign actors out there who might be skewing the facts for their own ends.
Thank you.
Tough question.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. My name's Virginia, and I'm a first-year MPP. As students who are all passionate about national security, what advice would you have for us to best maximize our time at college and prepare soft and hard skills to best serve in this important field?
Well, first, have fun in college. College is a great time. I tell my daughter that all the time. So enjoy college, but do a couple things. One, you don't realize how lucky you are right now that you're around a lot of intellectually vibrant people who are just psyched about learning and talking and agreeing and disagreeing and debating. And that's some of the best training you'll ever get, is if you have a friend circle who like to do that. And because, once you get into the workforce, sometimes just sitting around drinking beer and chewing on political issues, you just don't have the time for it. So do that. Look, take advantage of this kind of thing. I mean, every week you guys have somebody come in, you might agree or disagree with like what I say, but at least it's giving you a glimpse of like what life is like in the national security space. And obviously you have resources like Ashley who are here who can talk about it in the first person themselves. I did that. One of the, one of the things I did, I went to a lot of the visiting speakers when I was here, and we were just saying like DC schools, you have a leg up here because you've got access to so many people who've had really fascinating careers. So I would do that, and then I would think about summer jobs up in DC. I mean, I grew up in DC. I live in DC. I'm a little biased about DC, but it is a place where the currency is sort of information and knowledge and know-how, political know-how. And whether you want to go into that as a career or not, it's energizing. So for instance, doing a spin on Capitol Hill. Capitol Hill has, I mean, it has its challenges. It's not, I don't think you can pay me enough to be a congressperson at this point in history, but being up there and sort of understanding, learning how the place operates, great experience. So those are a few of the ideas I'd have.
Sir, did you have a question?
I was going to ask a very similar question, so I'm glad a student asked.
Okay.
I thought you were going to ask an actual question, so I jumped and came up here. We do have time for one more if there is an additional question.
Hi, my name is Anna Douglas, and I'm a second year here. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about how your work interacts with foreign allies and how, if at all, the increasing globalization and interconnectedness of our world has affected that work with allies, specifically to combat counterintelligence.
So let me answer on behalf sort of the USG and the intelligence community, and then I'll talk about INA. So look, the CIA, ever since it was created in 1947, has put a real focus on developing relationships with our foreign counterparts. And so, when I would travel in my other government positions and I'd go see the chief of station was always there working, in the meetings with their foreign intelligence counterparts, often the foreign, government leaders. So that's nothing new for the CIA, NSA, and our sort of foreign-facing intelligence community agencies. They've been doing that for generations. It is interesting from, well, let me then answer about the Bureau. And the Bureau, once again, has always worked with foreign counterparts. Post 9/11, as it really became much more of a national security intelligence-driven organization, in addition to being a law enforcement organization, always had the mandate, but really sort of grew the capability. A lot of that was interconnectedness with our partners overseas. So there's just, a greater closeness between the Bureau now and their counterparts overseas because they're constantly working issues together. DHS also, I mean, every morning I get what's called the President's Daily Brief, the PDB, which is the sort of the set brief that principals around the government get, which is what the president gets. And I get it with the secretary and deputy secretary and a couple others. And, every morning the secretary's talking about reaching out to the foreign minister, in Mexico or other governments, because Homeland Security is so intertwined with the operations of our partners around the world. INA ourselves, we're less involved with foreign partners. We do some interaction, definitely, and we share some intelligence. But to the point I made earlier, we're much more focused on the partnership with the partners within the United States. That's our sweet spot. And some in the past, in the history of INA, have sort of tried to build or develop more interaction between us and overseas partners. I personally have, I've been traveling overseas as much as I like, to go on the wine and brie circuit over in Europe. It's not our sweet spot. And our fellow agencies are probably better positioned to do most of that. We do some, but better for them to do it. I go to Detroit instead.
Okay.
So I often find myself in a position where I have to explain what the comparative advantage is for the University of Virginia when it comes to national security issues. I think this is exactly it, right? So we can bring folks down, easy drive, hopefully not
That was a great drive.
from DC who are at the very highest levels on these leading edge issues. But we're a little outside the boat, and so we can bring a little light where there's usually maybe just a lot of heat on really tough topics. And so thank you for doing that for us today. I would say to the students in the room, for those of you who are interested in these issues, I see many familiar faces, but also some unfamiliar faces. Come hang out with us at the National Security Policy Center. This is not the Batten School's first interaction with INA. We had a group of students working on exactly these issues in a class setting for Steve and Ken, who did some really interesting stuff, fantastic work. And so I really encourage all of you to figure out what your pathway is in to see if this is the kind of thing that's for you. Thanks to the Batten School for hosting this event. Thanks to the Miller Center for co-hosting it. And then finally, and most significantly, thank you, Ken. Thank you, Ashley. It was a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. Thanks.